Good evening, and welcome to the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. Thank you for joining us for our final Evenings at Ease program for the year. If this is your first time joining us, our 2023 annual theme is Difficult Decisions. All year, we've been exploring tough decisions made during the Eisenhower administration. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Mr. Peter Shinkle. He will be talking to us about Robert Cutler and the Lavender Scare. Mr. Shinkle, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Joy. It's a pleasure to be here. And I have a great fondness for the Eisenhower Library and for the excellent staff there. I did work for this book, my book, Ike's Mystery Man, over a period of years there and really came to appreciate the institution. And the story of the Lavender Scare is connected in a fundamental way to the close relationship between President Dwight D. Eisenhower and his national security advisor, Robert Cutler. Here you see President Eisenhower at left and President Eisenhower at left and Robert Cutler at the right. The Lavender Scare is the persecution of gay and lesbian employees of the federal government in the 1950s in Washington. The name reflects the fact that it was an offshoot of the Red Scare of Senator Joseph McCarthy, as we'll see a little later. But to really understand what caused the Lavender Scare, it is vital to understand the relationship between the president, Ike, and his friend and national security advisor, whom he called simply Bobby. Bobby, as we will learn later, was a closeted gay man. Now, this photo was taken in fall of 1952. As Ike, then the GOP presidential nominee, was on the Eisenhower Special, a train that carried him across the country. The candidate's private car, where he met regularly with his advisors, and where he and his wife Mamie had private compartments, was a place where Bobby spent many hours with the president and got to know him very well. Ike was, of course, the victorious general who led U.S. forces on D-Day, and he had resigned in 1948 to serve as Columbia University's president, but then returned to military duty in 1950 when President Truman appointed him to be the first Supreme Allied Commander for NATO forces in Europe. And Cutler was a Republican from Boston who served in the War Department during World War II and had ended his war years with the rank of Brigadier General. He then became president of a large bank in Boston. In November 1950, Cutler held a dinner in Ike's honor in Boston. And Cutler and his good friend and political ally, Massachusetts U.S. Senator Cabot Lodge Jr., both grew to believe Ike should run for president as a Republican. In September 1951, Lodge went to see Ike in Paris and tried to convince him to run for president as a Republican. Ike refused to commit, but Lodge soon went ahead and put Ike's name on Republican primary ballots in New Hampshire, and that move was copied in other states. Ike for President clubs sprang up around the country. Still, Ike refused to declare a party, and he didn't leave his NATO position or announce he was running. Finally, in March of 1952, Ike declared himself to be a Republican and said he was running for president. Cutler and Lodge immediately swung into action and went to the Republican convention in Houston, Texas, to ensure that Ike won the nomination, which he did. After he was nominated, Ike put together plans for the Eisenhower Special campaign train to crisscross the United States in September and October of 1952. And Senator Lodge convinced him to take his good friend Bobby Cutler along with him to serve as a speechwriter and advisor on national security issues. It was at this point that Ike sought the help of this man, Republican U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. McCarthy had first been elected to the Senate in 1946, As the Soviet Union and its communist allies seized control of Eastern Europe and other nations in the late 1940s, McCarthy found he could get tremendous media attention by playing on fears of communists in the United States government. In February 1950, McCarthy made the speech recognized as the opening salvo of his Red Scare. In Wheeling, West Virginia, speaking to a women's club, he proclaimed that he had a secret list of 205 communists in the State Department. It set off a scramble by the Truman administration to respond and defend itself. The department denied it was harboring communists and demanded that McCarthy identify any communists in the department so the remaining employees could be free of the taint of McCarthy's accusation. The State Department acknowledged that 202 employees had been dismissed, and of the 95 dismissed recently, most of these were homosexuals. Suddenly, with that one statement, homosexuality had been associated in a very high-profile way with communist subversion. This would set the stage for a sinister manipulation of numbers to conflate and combine the two menaces that so upset many Americans. Now, at this time, America was already on fire with concerns about homosexualities. Two major books in 1948 had exposed how common homosexuality was. Gore Vidal's novel, The City and the Pillar, and Alfred Kinsey's study, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, had caused a virtual revolution in the understanding of homosexuality among American people. Kinsey's study itself discovered or reported that 37% of men have at least one homosexual experience in their lives. A backlash followed quickly, as you can imagine. A congressional committee warned that homosexuals in government could easily be turned into spies, and J. Edgar Hoover launched a program, a so-called sex deviates program, and distributed a memo warning of sex deviates in federal government service. At this time, of course, homosexual conduct was a crime nationwide. Joseph McCarthy ultimately would say his list of communists was whittled down to as few as 81 people, though he never made it public. But he continued accusing the Truman administration and Democrats of being weak on security, and he called for a full investigation of the federal government and its workforce. Now, at this time, Chinese communists were backing the war by their allies in North Korea, who had invaded South Korea, and General MacArthur led American and United Nations forces against those invaders. But this only amplified fear of communist subversion in the American populace. In June of 1951, McCarthy's campaign, his Red Scare campaign, veered into the ludicrous as he went to the floor of the Senate and made a lengthy speech accusing General George Marshall, the highly decorated Army Chief of Staff throughout World War II, of a sinister betrayal to the communists. He charged Marshall with conspiring with Truman's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, to turn over control of China to the communists in the years after World War II. There was absolutely no evidence to support this. And in fact, both men had worked extensively to prevent a communist takeover in China. But that didn't stop McCarthy from making his wild allegations. Does any of this sound familiar, by the way? Eisenhower was a close friend and a strong admirer of General Marshall. In fact, the men had worked closely during the war years. In August of 1952, Ike defended Marshall from this attack by McCarthy, saying, "I have no patience for anyone who can find in his record of service for this country anything to criticize." As the election campaign unfolded, Ike criticized the Democrats for laxness on national security and failing to confront the spread of communism. He wanted the backing of the fervid anti-communist voting bloc that was led by Joe McCarthy. In early 1952, Ike's train was in Wisconsin. McCarthy's home state, which had voted for Truman 4 years earlier. Polling showed the Democratic nominee, Adlai Stevenson, running close to Ike. As the Eisenhower special headed into Wisconsin, McCarthy boarded the train and spent the night there. Ike was seeking McCarthy's support, and in one of their discussions, the two men argued over the contents of Ike's speech planned for Milwaukee, which the speech included another defense of Marshall. It was while he was on that train ride through Wisconsin that Ike planned to seek McCarthy's support so he could win the state. Ike gave a brief speech calling for ridding the government of anyone who is subversive or disloyal, but Ike made no mention of Marshall. In a speech in Appleton, McCarthy's hometown, the two men appeared on the back platform of the train, and McCarthy introduced Ike to the assembled crowd and said he would make a great president. As the train flew through Wisconsin toward Milwaukee, Ike huddled with Bobby Cutler and other speechwriters, wondering what to do about the provision or the defense of McCarthy. The scene would have looked something like this. Here you see Ike and Bobby at work in the presidential car on the Eisenhower special at some point during the campaign. At some point, Ike agreed during the discussions that day after the meetings with McCarthy, Ike agreed to remove the defense of Marshall from his speech. Bobby Cutler, known as a staunch critic of McCarthy, appears to have remained silent and accepted Ike's decision. Finally, the train arrived in Milwaukee. McCarthy went to visit Ike at his hotel, where Bobby led him to Ike's room. Ike and McCarthy met alone. In his speech that night in Milwaukee, October 3, 1952, Ike attacked the Democrats for tolerating communist penetration of the federal government. He even accused the Democrats of treason. He said he shared McCarthy's goals of ridding the government of subversives, though he also said he disagreed with McCarthy's methods. But by deleting his defense of Marshall, Ike upheld the alliance, albeit a temporary one, that he had built with McCarthy. In the days that followed, McCarthy began campaigning vigorously for Ike. He even said he was so confident that Ike would rid the nation of communist subversion that if Ike won the election, McCarthy would stop his one-man crusade against communist infiltration. Ike headed back to the East Coast, where on November 3, the night before the election, he spoke at a rally in the Boston Garden Arena, where he was introduced by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. Here you see Ike riding in an open car through Cambridge Square near Harvard, with Bobby Cutler at Ike's left wearing a fedora. In the election of November 4, Ike soundly defeated Stevenson. There is no doubt that his deep appeal to the nation's anti-communist concerns, backed by Joseph McCarthy, had played a major role in his victory. On the same day Ike was inaugurated, January 20, 1953, his Attorney General, former RNC Chairman Herbert Brownell, recommended to the president that he sign an executive order tightening rules for federal employment. When Bobby Cutler saw Brownell's memo, he realized that a much more detailed and comprehensive program of rules for hiring federal employees had already been prepared. This was a set of rules that had been developed by the Truman administration, but which Truman himself never implemented, likely in part because it would have been pounced on as evidence that McCarthy was right. Cutler considered the Truman rules to be well thought out, in part because they had been developed by a committee of experts on security and hiring of federal employees. The rules included a prohibition on the hiring of any employee who had any of the following demerits: alcoholism, criminal convictions, lying, and, quote, sexual perversion, close quote. The rules did not define what was meant by sexual perversion. Now, if you think about that for a moment, you will realize what an extraordinary moment we were in American consciousness of sexual behavior at that time. The government could take action against you for, quote, sexual perversion, close quote, and didn't have to define it because, well, I guess everyone had some sort of idea about what sexual perversion was, but no one really wanted to talk about it. Ike asked Bobby to send the Truman Rules to Brownell with a recommendation that Brownell, the Attorney General, take up the rules and revise them as he saw fit. This is Herbert Brownell, the Attorney General. Now, when Brownell produced the draft rules 3 months later, he passed them to Bobby and other administration officials for his review. They still included the ban on, quote, sexual perversion, close quote, but it still had no definition. It went beyond saying no person with the stated demerits should be hired by federal agencies. In fact, it said employees suspected of having these traits should be investigated and, at the discretion of investigators, terminated from employment. Astonishingly, perhaps, Bobby made no objection to the sexual perversion terminology, nor did anyone else. On April 27, 1953, Ike signed the rules as Executive Order 10450. Ike said he wanted to follow through on his promise of improving security, but the rule he issued would turn out to be a gift to McCarthy. Indeed, McCarthy applauded the rules immediately after they were issued. So now arises the question, how is it that Bobby Cutler, who was a closeted gay man, apparently not only made no effort to block this executive order, but actively helped it become the law of the land? To answer that, I'd like to give you a quick whirlwind picture, a pictorial tour of the life of Bobby Cutler. Bobby was born in Brookline, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston, in 1895. Extremely close to his mother, who introduced him to literature. He was extremely close to his mother, who introduced him to literature, and she died at an early age. Bobby fell in love with the theater and loved acting, a love he carried through until his mature years. He had close attachments to young men, as shown by this photo of him at age 18 after his freshman year at Harvard. He was the youngest of 5 brothers, here shown with their father, George. All were Republicans in the most Republican of families. All went to Harvard. All were vigorous supporters of President Theodore Roosevelt. After graduating from Harvard, Bobby published his first novel about the difficulties of men and women in romantic relationships. Then he soon enrolled in Harvard Law, where he was an editor of the Law Review. He's seated in the front row, second from the left in this picture. A second romance novel came a few years later. Bobby believed deeply that all Americans should support national defense, and he volunteered for service in World War I and eventually served as a military policeman in France. After he returned to the United States and began his law practice, he became friends with Cabot Lodge, shown here at the far right, during a cruise in the Caribbean at a costume event on a ship. Bobby is in a dress with a parasol, while his dear friend Chan Bigelow to the left seems entirely unamused. After the war, Bobby began his private law practice in Boston, and he became good friends with the reformist Democratic mayor of Boston, Maurice Tobin, seen here at left with Bobby. Tobin eventually hired him as corporation counsel for the city of Boston. Bobby's ability to build an alliance with Democrats in Boston showed he could work across the aisle politically. So Henry Stimson, the Republican who served as Franklin D. Roosevelt's Secretary of War, hired Bobby to serve in the War Department to ease political disputes. Here, Stimson awards Bobby the Distinguished Service Medal in 1945. At the end of the war, he quietly tamped down a congressional investigation of homosexuality that targeted members of the U.S. Army. Fast forward to the fall of 1952, when Bobby is on the campaign train with Ike. Bobby meets a young man there named Steve Benedict, who is gay. Steve recognized that Bobby is gay, but he never discusses it with him. But after Ike wins the election, Steve introduces Bobby to his former lover, Skip Coons. Skip is a former naval intelligence officer who grew up in New Jersey and then learned Russian in the Navy before serving in China after the war's end. Bobby becomes extremely excited about Skip, and in April 1953, hires him sight unseen, even though Skip at this time is working on his dissertation in Paris. By this time, Bobby has been designated to be the first national security advisor of the United States, and he is setting up the first fully functioning National Security Council staff to help President Eisenhower with a broad array of national security matters, such as the nuclear arms race. Skip will join that staff. Over the next few years, Bobby becomes obsessed with Skip and begins writing a regular diary about his intense love for Skip. Here they are in 1957, next to the swimming pool at Dumbarton Oaks, which is a Washington mansion then owned by Harvard University. These are the diaries that Bobby wrote about his love for Skip, with a few notes about other men along the way, I might add. The man sitting behind them is Steve Benedict, who wound up with the diaries after Skip's death in 2005. Steve eventually gave the diaries to me so that I could write the story of Bobby Cutler, which is in my book, Ike's Mystery Man. So all of this leads us back to the question, why did Bobby Cutler let the, quote, sexual perversion, close quote, provision enter Executive Order 10450? There is no evidence in all the research I've done, no statement by Bobby explaining why he did this, why he acted the way he did with Executive 10450. But part of the answer may lie in this photo. Excuse me. Here you see Bobby at right, seated poolside at a U.S. government training facility in Quantico, Virginia, with other members of the Eisenhower cabinet. This is part of this photo ran with an article called Mystery Man of the White House in the Saturday Evening Post, February 1954, which profiled Bobby in great detail. Bobby has taken a dip. He's completely at ease, holding forth. The other men appear to be giving him their rapt attention. He was completely in control in this environment. The hunt for homosexuals by this time is raging across Washington. But Bobby is cool as a cucumber, chatting up with Attorney General Brownell, Defense Secretary Charles Wilson, and others. By the way, I should add that he kept a very friendly relationship with J. Edgar Hoover. So, in light of all this, back to the question of why Bobby Cutler did not object to the sexual perversion terminology in Executive 10450. I think the best theory I can offer is that Bobby had become an extremely gifted practitioner of the tormented art of living one's life in the closet. He had seen many prohibitions against homosexuality in law and in social settings, in customs, on the street, and he had come to assume that this was merely another one of those prohibitions, one that he could deal with, one that gay people could deal with, as they always had. This also might have been because Ike had shown his own tolerance of homosexuality and very likely understood that Bobby was gay. In short, Bobby did not grasp that Executive Order 10450, in fact, posed a major threat to many gay and lesbian people. I would note that another reason why Bobby might not have objected is that doing so would have raised a red flag. and would have marked him in a way that he would not have welcomed and that what he would have been concerned about. In the end, what happened is that the federal government soon began hunting for gays and lesbians in the ranks of its employees. Ike's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, had appointed a henchman of McCarthy's as the head of internal security, the internal security division of the State Department. That man pursued a wave of investigations into the sexual behavior of State Department employees, and the investigation spread to other agencies. Within just 6 months, by October 1953, Executive Order 10450 had caused almost 59,000 investigations, causing 2,823 employees to resign, 843 to be fired, and 50 job applicants rejected. But the executive order would remain in place for more than a decade. The court rulings later narrowed its scope. But ultimately, advocates suggest as many as 10,000 gay and lesbian people may have lost jobs or been refused jobs as a result of the order. McCarthy, desperate to back up his claims of subversion to find significant evidence of communists in the government, seized on these numbers. Unable to find significant evidence of communists, he pointed instead to the data on investigations of, quote, subversives as proof that he was right. This was the crux of the Lavender Scare. The human cost of the Lavender Scare was immense. People who came under investigation saw their careers and relationships thrown into chaos. Some people committed suicide. If there is one lesson to take from all of this, it is that people seeking political power will use whatever tools they can to build up fear of a vulnerable minority. We as citizens must always be on the lookout for this kind of fear-mongering and scapegoating. And that's all I've got. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and we will get those asked and hopefully answered. In the meantime, I do have a few questions. So first of all, you talk about how McCarthy never made his list public. This list that he supposedly had of communists and of and I assume also of gay and lesbians. He never made these lists public. So is it widely believed that this list didn't actually exist, or was it that he just liked holding it over people's heads, like the power?
I think suspicions ran both ways. That it was that he didn't actually have a list. He didn't actually have names. To the fact that he liked to have leverage over people. To this day, I don't think there is a clear answer on what was in that list. And I think it sort of goes down in history as sort of the centerpiece of McCarthyism, really, that and the Army McCarthy hearings of 1954. That sort of willingness to use vague and unsubstantiated allegations to smear people and drive mass political support and to try to seize power. There were wide speculations at this time and good reasons for them to believe that McCarthy was hoping to run for the presidency. So that sort of fear mongering is just was part of his bag of tricks.
Okay. All right. So it is widely known that Ike, or maybe it's not widely known, but I work at the Eisenhower Library, so it's widely known for us. But that Ike considered McCarthy to be kind of a pest, and so he didn't really think, during the height of McCarthyism, before he really didn't think he needed to address him. He thought that if he did address him, that would give him that would add fuel to the fire. And so do you think that that was a mistake when we're talking about specifically about lavender laws, specifically about kind of this lavender scare?
Well, I do think it is correct that Ike didn't want to empower him, but he also understood that he needed McCarthy's power because he needed the support of McCarthy's base. When he came into Wisconsin on his campaign train, there was legitimate concern among the Republicans that Truman was going to win Wisconsin again. And so he needed to treat McCarthy with kid gloves so that he would win his ardent support, and which he did. He removed the language defending General Marshall from the speech, and by siding with McCarthy in condemning and sounding alarms about communism and the Democrats selling out the nation and being treasonous and welcoming communists into the federal government, he emboldened McCarthy. And he gave McCarthy more power. And I think that that's something that we can't overlook. It was a decision that Ike made trying to win the presidency, but I think it had very damaging consequences. Chiefly, I think that it emboldened McCarthy to pursue his witch hunt with ever greater vigor in 1953 and 1954. And at that time, standing up to McCarthy took even greater energy from the president. So by ignoring it and trying to get advantage from his relationship with McCarthy in 1952, he set the stage for a much bigger problem in later years. So I think those people who today would coddle a bully and accommodate a bully should be forewarned that they're creating a much bigger problem down the road.
Okay. So I want to talk about kind of the consequences of well, actually, I'll wait. We have a question in the chat, so we'll ask that one first. It says, did Cutler ever come out later in life?
He never did come out. He except to maybe some friends in social settings. I don't think that would really count as coming out. He had friends who knew that he was gay, and he would let it be known in social settings, but he never acknowledged it in public. He died in 1974. And I think that, that was an era when many people lived their full lives in the closet. And that is in essence what he did.
So now I want to kind of move to the bigger consequences of lavender laws, sort of the trickle down effect of them, or the lavender scare. Now I'm proudly from Florida sometimes, but and specifically I'm from Panama City, Florida, and in Florida there was something called the Purple Pamphlet that was led by a state senator representing Panama City, and I believe his name was Charlie Johns, but that in Florida led to professors getting fired from universities and things like that. I mean, it was a combination of the Purple Pamphlet, like this gay and lesbian scare, and it mixed in with communist and communism and civil rights movement and all of those things. But now, Florida is just one example, but I've read and heard that things like this, laws like this, were widespread. Once the federal government kind of was okay with it, I guess, appeared to be okay with it, all across the country, other states started implementing these kinds of laws. So I want to talk about that a little bit. And I don't really know where my question is here, but just how does this overarching federal law impact average citizens across the country in different states?
I can tell you that it is amazing how it spread. The white hot nucleus of the Lavender Scare was in the State Department, but it spread to different federal agencies, and they were expected to implement their investigations wherever they existed or around the country, and they did so. It had a very far-reaching impact, and in agencies where, like, you wouldn't really think would prioritize this kind of thing. Um, for example, the National Gallery of Art. Is that really a place where we need to be worried about subversion of the government? Evidently, um, the Eisenhower administration wound up believing that. Um, in terms of a broader impact and spreading of this kind of witch hunt, to borrow a popular term, to other states and other agencies, maybe on the local or state level, I'm afraid that's an area that I can't offer much. I'm not familiar with that. I'm sure it's a very interesting area for investigation, but I'm not familiar with those kinds of things.
Okay, I do understand that.
Mhm.
So we don't have any other questions in the chat. So this is our last evenings at ease for the year. So I do want to kind of bring it all together with this idea of difficult decisions. And so I know that, well, at least from what I've gathered from your presentation, for me, the difficult decision here is that, Eisenhower really needed McCarthy, needed his power for his campaign. So how does he, how do I put it? How does he accept McCarthy or use McCarthy without compromising so many people? If it's not just the Lavender Scare, but through the Red Scare as well. So would you agree with that? Or
Well, I do think it was a very difficult decision because we know that McCarthy was uh, very objectionable to President or to then candidate Eisenhower because of his attack on General Marshall, which was a preposterous, flagrant, made up set of challenges and smear, basically. And yet Ike made the choice to seek McCarthy's support and to coddle McCarthy and to withdraw his defense of Marshall. That's a very difficult decision. And that's the kind of decision that politicians make sometimes that they wish they could not make, that they could unmake. And I do think there are signs that Ike regretted that in years later. Um, and the other difficult decision here is Cutler's, but we'll never know whether he um, deeply regretted that executive order or that he didn't think about it, that he believed he had no choice and that it simply had to be done. So that's a kind of a mystery, whether that is a difficult decision or not. I do know that many people, very many people, felt that that was a terrible policy and a disgraceful policy and a stain on American democracy. And you'll get no argument from me on that point.
All right. Well, then, if there are not any more questions in the chat, and I don't see any, I will just say thank you so much for your presentation. It's greatly appreciated. And it was an excellent presentation. I've been wanting to talk about this for a while now. Something I'd learned about in a previous position in Florida, and then happened to come work at the Eisenhower Library, where the Lavender Scare was a part of his administration. So I'm excited that I got to talk about this.
Excellent, Joy. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great speaking with the folks at the Eisenhower Library again.
All right. Well, we do have a few announcements. So if everyone just hang with us just for a few minutes. So first of all of our 2023 public programs are made possible by the Eisenhower Foundation and the Jeffcoat Memorial Foundation. And so we always want to say a big thank you to them because without them, we would not be able to bring you these programs, and we are certainly appreciative. If you would like to know about our next programs or any of our future programs, please join our email list. You can find that on our website at eisenhowerlibrary.gov. And join our email list. If you can see right there, you can click on it and you will get emails about our upcoming programs. All right. Well, if there aren't any other comments or questions, I will say good night to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and have a great evening.